translation. We also have live translation in Spanish, courtesy of our translator, Pamela. If you'd like translation, please click the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select the channel. Today marks the publication of the UN scientists' key report on mitigation strategies for the climate crisis. The report adds to the growing body of scientific evidence that is increasing that there is an increasingly small window left to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid worst case scenarios. Though small, the window of opportunity is there, and we need to start acting now. The report officially comes out in just under an hour, and we can expect a handful of headline messages. That international cooperation is a critical enabler for achieving ambitious climate change mitigation goals. That keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive means transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, demand side measures, and energy efficiency. That continued installation of unabated fossil fuel infrastructure will lock in greenhouse gas emissions. That limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below will leave a substantial amount of fossil fuels unburned and could strand considerable fossil fuel infrastructure. That nearly all mitigation options face institutional barriers that need to be addressed to apply these solutions at scale. Talks on the final draft of the latest comprehensive assessment of climate science from the IPCC stretched hours past their deadline on Sunday. Scientists and governments were locked in disagreement on questions such as how much funding was likely to be needed for developing countries to tackle the climate crisis, and what emphasis to give policies such as phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So what does this all mean? What does this mean in terms of tackling fossil fuels head on when we know that they're the biggest driver of the climate crisis? What does this mean for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign? As the window of action narrows, how is the Fossil Fuel Treaty the bold idea that we need today? We have many speakers today, so let's just get started right away to make sure that there's some time for Q&A in the end. I want to welcome our first speaker. Humberto de la Calle Lombana is a Colombian lawyer and politician. He previously served as Vice President of Colombia and was the lead negotiator of the Havana peace agreement between the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrilla. He has recently been elected to the Senate of Colombia and will begin his term in July. Sorry, Humberto, I lost you in the screen for a second and I wasn't sure if I still had you. Can you tell us, what do you think this report means for the incoming Congress and the government in Colombia?
Bueno, mil gracias. Un saludo desde Colombia a todos y a todas. Primero, se espera que el informe del IPCC reafirme los riesgos que afronta la humanidad a consecuencia del cambio climático. Pero no solo eso, sino que muestre seguramente la urgencia en la toma de decisiones. En efecto, como lo acabas de decir, los flujos de financiación pública y privada para la industria de los combustibles fósiles siguen siendo mayores que los destinados a la adaptación y mitigación al cambio climático. Los planes de expansión de la producción de combustibles fósiles excederán considerablemente el presupuesto de carbono que tenemos para lograr el 1.5 grados centígrados. No es suficiente con detener los nuevos proyectos, sino que hay que eliminar gradualmente la producción existente. Incluso si no se construyeran nuevos proyectos de combustibles fósiles a partir de hoy, las emisiones de las infraestructuras existentes de carbón, petróleo y gas por sí solas dispararían el presupuesto de carbono de 1.5 grados centígrados en más de un 130%. Aunque son urgentes, las soluciones de mitigación a nivel global todavía cuentan con muchas barreras institucionales. El informe dejará en claro cuáles son las regiones y países con mayor responsabilidad en las emisiones históricas actuales: Norteamérica, Europa, Asia del Este. Las soluciones deben tener un indispensable componente de equidad global. Ahora bien, veamos el caso de Colombia y el papel del Congreso de Colombia. Colombia no es un gran emisor de gases de efecto invernadero. Se sitúa alrededor del 0,04% de la emisión mundial, pero en cambio está sujeta a una enorme vulnerabilidad. Su dependencia fiscal de las exportaciones de petróleo y carbón es enorme, y el proceso de deforestación, sobre todo en la porción de la Amazonía ubicada en nuestro territorio, es extremadamente preocupante. Se estima que el 80% de nuestros habitantes están expuestos a daños severos a consecuencia del cambio climático. A esto contribuye su geografía compleja. La mayor parte de la población habita en zonas de ladera y en 3 cordilleras que atraviesan su territorio. La deforestación de la Amazonía es consecuencia de la expansión ilegal de la frontera agrícola, en buena parte promovida por grupos delincuenciales para sembrar coca. En los últimos 5 años se han perdido 1.200.000 hectáreas de bosques, de las cuales 600.000 corresponden a la Amazonía colombiana. 2.500 kilómetros de carreteras informales muestran la gravedad de la expansión. Colombia depende en gran medida del ingreso fiscal por petróleo y carbón. Aunque es un sector que no genera muchos empleos, sí ocupa el primer puesto en exportaciones. Si el próximo gobierno no se toma en serio este tipo de reportes, como el del IPCC, correrá el riesgo de seguir financiando una industria que no tiene mucho futuro. Fiscalmente, Colombia no puede hoy salir sola de la producción en el tiempo que se necesita para seguir contribuyendo a la mitigación. Por eso, repito que la equidad global es clave. Los activos con mayor riesgo de quedar varados son los asociados a carbón. Colombia es el 7º productor mundial de carbón. Colombia requiere de un marco global en el que le sea posible salir del modelo basado en la explotación de combustibles fósiles. Debe poder apoyarse en compromisos internacionales para iniciar una transición efectiva y justa, tanto en el campo de emisiones por uso de combustibles fósiles como por emisiones causadas por deforestación y cambio de uso del suelo. El marco en el que deberían ocurrir los acuerdos internacionales debe establecer las acciones para frenar la industria de los combustibles fósiles, salir escalonadamente de la producción actual y que la transición se haga en forma equitativa. ¿Qué debe hacer el Congreso, al cual ingresaré el próximo 20 de julio? Desde el Congreso debe haber un compromiso para adecuar la estructura institucional y legal para que sea posible una transición rápida y justa, especialmente frenar el otorgamiento de licencias mineras de carbón, detener la minería ilegal, regular la minería artesanal y frenar la deforestación. Por otro lado, continuar impulsando programas efectivos de prevención de riesgos a consecuencia del cambio climático y brindar incentivos a las energías limpias. Mil gracias por la posibilidad de intervenir en el día de hoy.
Thank you so much, Senator. I know what a busy day it is for you, and we appreciate you joining us this morning. I want to move now to Carol Muffett. Carol Muffett is the president of the Center for International Environmental Law, a nonprofit organization that uses the power of law to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. Carol, the summary for policymakers allows us to say the IPCC and world governments agree on certain findings of the report, but also means that we see delays like what happened in the last 24 hours. What does this latest report potentially mean for what's to come at COP27?
Thanks. I think to understand what's heading our way for COP27, it's critical to recognize that this most recent report, the report of Working Group 3, follows on the heels of two previous reports, the Working Group 1 report on the physics and the Working Group 2 report on the impacts. Those reports tell a critical story that the physics are inevitable and inexorable. Every ton of CO2 that we add to the climate pushes us closer to irreversible catastrophe and steepens the curve that we need to turn back to restore some manner of stability to our climate. And critically, with the Working Group 2 report, we saw a real recognition that if the world goes beyond 1.5 degrees of warming, even temporarily, it will result in irreversible losses to ecosystems, to communities, to cultures worldwide. And so this is really important in understanding the mitigation strategies that are being pursued. Increasingly, what we see playing out in policy spaces is a profound disconnect between political comfort levels with the action that is needed and what the science tells us is urgently needed. The science is clear. The only way that we avert climate catastrophe is rapidly phasing out the use of fossil fuels, beginning not in 2025, not in 2024, but immediately. There is no further room for expansion. What we see playing out in the debate over the summer for policymakers, however, is a political discomfort with that reality and a heavy reliance on purported solutions to the climate crisis that rely on futuristic technologies, which rely on creative accounting, which allow us to say, yes, we're going to do something later, when in fact the science tells us that we need to be doing something now. So one of the real things that we see playing out in this latest report is when you get down into the technical details, the technical summaries from Working Group 3, you see repeated warnings from the IPCC that we should not be relying so heavily on futuristic solutions like carbon capture and storage, carbon dioxide removal, because reliance on those approaches will push us beyond 1.5 degrees with irreversible impacts. And yet what you see playing out in the debate over the summary for policymakers is a recurring effort to mask that core scientific reality and to argue that we need carbon dioxide removal to respond to the climate crisis. That is only true. That is only true if we don't immediately start the phasing out of fossil fuels that are driving that crisis. I think this is one of the key debates we will see between here and COP27. Is on the one hand, the science is increasingly clear that we are out of time, that these false solutions are not buying us any additional time and risk derailing meaningful workable solutions like accelerating renewable energy deployments, accelerating electrification. The science is increasingly clear that that is the way we solve the climate crisis. The messaging that we're seeing coming out of this report, that we're seeing coming out of governments, is, you know what, that is politically too hard, and so we're going to focus on carbon dioxide removal in 2040, 2050, and beyond. The core message that I want to leave you with is the core message of Working Group 3, which is ultimately our political and economic assumptions about climate mitigation have to change. Our political and economic assumptions about what is feasible have to change, because they are the only things that can change. The physics cannot, and the physics tell us that we have to stop burning fossil fuels immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And can I just ask you one quick follow-up? You are a lawyer, international lawyer, and also a member of the Global Steering Committee for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Why do you think the Fossil Fuel Treaty is so important right now on the heels of this report?
I think the Fossil Fuel Treaty is critical because it fills a gap that the UNFCCC in 3 decades has not been able to fill. At COP26, we saw the parties acknowledge for the first time that fossil fuels are driving the climate crisis, yet lack the courage to confront that crisis. We need to recognize that fossil fuels are weapons of mass global destruction, that they are driving human rights abuses, human rights violations at a global scale, and that those violations will only accelerate unless we confront fossil fuels. And I think it's finally critically important to recognize that fossil fuels are implicated not only in the climate crisis, but they are at the heart of numerous other crises that are pushing the world beyond planetary boundaries. I think the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is valuable in that it gives us a tool for confronting that driver of multiple crises head on at a moment when we don't have time to wait.
Thank you so much. I want to turn now to Svetlana Romanenko, who is a Zero Fossil Fuels campaign manager for the Laodicea movement and based in Ukraine. She has been an environmental lawyer for over 20 years and has also worked for 350.org and campaigned for a just green recovery and Green Deal in Eastern Europe. Svetlana, thank you so much for joining us. We can only imagine how difficult it is for you right now in your country. You're one of many Ukrainians in recent weeks who are amplifying a call on world governments to end global fossil fuel addiction that feeds Putin's war machine. How could the treaty play a role in ending that addiction?
Yes, thank you so much, Stepora, for having me here today. And of course, we witness our world changing at an unprecedented pace. There are no words to describe the horrors that left behind by retreating Russian troops in Bucha and Irpin and Stoyanivka, or the barbarity continuing to be unleashed on civilians in Mariupol, Kharkiv, and other besieged cities and occupied territories in Ukraine right now. Most importantly, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty may help a war against Ukraine to end and prevent any other fossil fueled wars and tragedies of happening in the future. I'm among also many Ukrainians who demand the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty be implemented for our country and beyond in every region of our world. Today, the Ukrainian Climate Network has released a statement to implement the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine as well. We are calling on governments who have all necessary means to embargo and phase out fossil fuels to stop Putin's war machine immediately and endorse and implement the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means end expansion of any new oil, gas, and coal production, manage a global phase out of existing production of fossil fuels in a manner that is fair and just and equitable towards a just transition. These 3 pillars of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty also provide us with hope and the vision for socially responsible, equitable, and green post-war recovery for Ukraine and for many other regions that are facing extraordinary and violent conflicts created and leveraged by fossil fuels, especially in the countries of the global south. And we have no moral will or ethical choice to replace the current Russian oil and gas dominance and our dependence as a world on fossil fuels with other increased exploration in the countries of the global south specifically. And to the fossil fuels, we must remember, are weapons of mass destruction, threatening our ability to protect livelihoods, our lives, our civil rights as a humanity, our freedoms, security, including energy security, and the planet in general. And today's IPCC report adds to an already huge pile of evidence that fossil fuel production needs to be tackled head on and quickly. Reliance on oil, gas, and coal is the intentional embrace of mass destruction, violence, oppression, death, misery, and collapse at a global scale. Russia's war in Ukraine, this horrific war that we are witnessing right now, and the rising price of fossil fuels underscores the need for a new bold proposals like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to phase out oil, gas, and coal and rapidly transition the world towards renewable energy solutions. There is a desperate need for a humanity, for Ukrainians, and the profound hunger for change. Change that starts by adding bold ideas like treaty to our toolbox so we may be good caretakers for our common home. And at the end, I would like to add a prophetic advocacy voice of Father Jostrom Kurithidem, who is a coordinator of the Vatican dicastery of promoting integral human development, who said not a while ago at Laudato Si movement, my organization, who also encouraged and understands that this war has been created, has been leveraged by fossil fuels and has been financed by fossil fuels. So he said that Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty will address most of our crises: climate crisis, biodiversity loss, ecological crisis in general, and the question of peace. So we need to remember this, and we need to implement the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to end the war in Ukraine and conflicts all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svetlana, and for joining us in this terrible time. Our prayers are with you and your family and your country. The statement that Svetlana referred to from your Canadian civil society groups will be available later this morning, set to release at the same time as the IPCC report. I want to turn now to Mitzi Janelle Tam. Mitzi is the co-founder of Youth Advocates for Climate Action, the Fridays for the Future of the Philippines, and part of Fridays for the Future International Community. Mitzi, thank you for joining us. I know it's been a trying morning for you. It's good to see you. More than 2,000 youth have signed the letter calling on world governments to implement a fossil fuel treaty, and Fridays for the Future repeated that call at the People Not Profit strike last month. Why are these younger generation rallying behind a treaty?
We've seen how this fossil fuel obsessed society and system has led to so much destruction, especially for young people, not just in the future, but also today in the present. Just as Svetlana already mentioned, not just with the climate crisis, but also with social crises. We see that the destruction that's happening in our countries, especially in countries like the Philippines that have been devastated so much by the climate crisis, is being done purposefully. There is a willful ignorance by global North leaders and by the fossil fuel industry. There are names behind the destruction and devastation happening in our countries. Young people aren't just inheriting a world that is burning and flooding and melting. We are already living in it. We are being born into it. And that is why over 2,000 young people have already signed the youth letter for rallying behind the fossil fuel treaty and continuously striking whenever we can, even when it's so tiring to continuously yell out our demands. We know that we cannot stop because there is a greater evil that needs to be stopped, and that is the fossil fuel industry. There is a weapon of mass destruction of our generation that is threatening our lives today. And we understand and we know that there is nothing that can get in the way of us stopping this. We have no choice but to continue fighting. We have no choice but to make sure that this fossil fuel industry that is leading to our destruction and leading to so much devastation is stopped completely. And the IPCC report that will come out today will only prove again what young people and what civil society has been saying for decades, that we have to prioritize people and planet and not profit.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. I know it's a very challenging day for you and many others, and I appreciate you joining us this morning. I feel so honored to be moderating this webinar. I think I could spend an hour with each of you digging into your comments and talking about these issues. I want to turn now, though, to MP Saber Chowdhury, who is a member of parliament in Bangladesh from one of the constituencies of the capital, Dhaka. He has served as Deputy Minister of Ministry of Ports and Shipping and Deputy Minister for Local Government, Rural Development and Cooperatives. MP Chowdhury, you are one of several Global South parliamentarians, including Mercy Barons, who has also joined us today, to have initiated a call for a fossil fuel-free future. Can you tell us more about this group of 230 parliamentarians and your demands?
Thank you, Zipporah, and greetings to everyone from Dhaka, Bangladesh. 230 and growing, if I may say that, because we are seeing a lot of traction, a lot of interest from parliamentarians. And essentially what we are really talking about is we are trying to look at the disease rather than the symptoms of the disease. So, I think it's absolutely critical for us as parliamentarians and representatives of the people to go to the heart of the issue. And of course, I've always believed this, that we have an intergenerational perspective of issues rather than governments who tend to look at 4 or 5 year terms. So we are really thinking about the welfare of the people. I myself have been, involved in environment for a number of years. We have a provision in the Constitution of Bangladesh, which talks about protecting the environment, biodiversity. And we are, in fact, the only parliament in the world to have adopted a resolution or a motion declaring a parliamentary emergency. Other countries have talked about a climate emergency, but we have talked about a planetary emergency because it's not just the climate. You have disasters which are happening in far greater intensity and frequency than at any time in the past. We have a challenge with biodiversity because the loss is at an alarming rate. We also have a food security issue. We have water stress. And we are also, as the first speaker today talked about, we are well beyond planetary boundaries. And in fact, the Earth Overshoot Day is coming forward. So the real challenge is, how do we decarbonize our societies? Because we can talk about adaptation, which is of course critical for a country like Bangladesh. In fact, if you look at the entire UNFCCC discourse, it started off with mitigation, and then we moved to adaptation. And then we realized that, you simply can't adapt at this rate because there are natural limits to adaptation. Now we are also talking about loss and damage, which is a new issue that has come up. So, and the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold is going to be breached by 2030. There's a new report that has come up. So this really is an emergency. We don't have much time in hand. And to be very candid, even the UN process, and we have a treaty, so one of the questions I ask myself is, well, there is already a UN treaty which is supposed to be regulating and controlling climate change. Why do we need another treaty? So that's a question that has come in. But the reason for that, I think, is because we have simply not been able to deliver as per that UN treaty. Temperatures are rising, emissions are rising. We have more carbon in the environment than at any time in our history, and temperatures are also rising. So, the treaty, I think, has been largely frustrated, and that is because it works on the basis of consensus. Unless everyone agrees, there is no agreement. So despite all of the words, all of the rhetoric, and all of the noble sentiments, very little practical action has actually been taken to control climate change. So it has been the reverse. And it's not just climate change, it's climate chaos, it's climate crisis. Change is a very mild term. And I think whoever coined this phrase did it intentionally so that people don't take the issue as seriously as they should be taking. So there is a reason. And so what we are actually saying is that we should end new expansion of coal, oil, and gas. That's number one. Second, we are saying that the existing facilities, we should transition away from that. We should look at what we as parliamentarians can do in terms of policy, in terms of funding to ease this transition. And we believe that that is the only way that we can control this issue. And it's not just a question about economic loss, it's a question about existence. We refer to climate change as an existential threat. And what we are facing in Bangladesh today, the world is going to face tomorrow for sure. So it is time that we get together. We reimagine how we move away with this transition and how we move away from fossil fuels. We look at the supply side, we try and neutralize that. We look at the basics of the disease, and this is the only way to go about it. So we are in absolute solidarity with the objectives that you have outlined in the treaty. And we, for our part as parliamentarians, will try to engage in this whole process as constructively as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, MP Chowdhury, and for all of your leadership on this issue. It was a highlight for many of us at COP26, the release of your statement. And I have to admit, when I get down, I go back to your website to look at the progress, because every day there's more parliamentarians who have joined. We'll put the link for that website in the chat. I want to turn now to Beatrice Fihn. Beatrice is the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning campaign coalition that works to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. Beatrice, you've worked to mobilize civil society throughout the development of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that entered into force on January 22nd, 2021, which we've used as a model in developing this fossil fuel treaty campaign. How do you see treaties' role in anchoring international cooperation to eliminate global dangers?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. I think when it comes to these huge global existential threats like nuclear weapons, but also climate change, we really cannot afford to wait for every single government and every single state in the world to agree on a solution. We need to move faster than that because, you know, our humanity is at stake, really. And we need to set higher bars for governments and then work on pulling them up one by one to this new higher standard. And I think that international law is really a very good way to do so. It's not a perfect method, of course, international law, but it is one of the main tools that we have on the international arena. And we do know that it works. And I know that a lot of people want to sort of paint international law as a weak measure and it's ineffective or it doesn't work or governments will never apply them. And of course, in times like this right now, it's very easy to watch something like Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and feel very demoralized about international law. But I also think that that's not the whole truth. International law does shift behavior. It makes governments work differently, and we'll develop those laws into norms where we can also expect regular people and other actors to comply with them. And while, of course, we've watched, for example, Russia violate law after law, international agreement in horror, we've also seen how the rest of the world have responded to those violations based on these laws. The fact that we had a UN charter, the Geneva Conventions, the bans on landmines and cluster munitions, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons makes it easier for all of us to say that's actually wrong. And we're going to take some action against it. So no, we can't, of course, always control actions based on law, but we can control our responses. And I think that's a really important, because of course it's not the end sort of like the end goal to have a treaty. The end goal is to shift behavior, and it's one of those very effective tools that we have to shift behavior. So when I saw how almost the whole world has responded to Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons, to the violations of the Geneva Conventions, the violation of the UN Charter, seeing these enormous sanctions, not enough. They need to, of course, end all fossil fuel dependency immediately. But it's based on international law, and they're using these treaties to justify that. And we see the treaties work even if not all states have joined it. Watching President Zelensky, for example, talking about how Putin needs to face the International Criminal Court because of his use of illegal cluster bombs was really a big deal, because Russia has not signed that treaty and Ukraine has not signed that treaty. Yet we are using that as the standard. The US has not signed that treaty, but the US talked about these illegal weapons, criticizing Russia for using them. And I think that that shows the power of these treaties, that they set new norms and they raise our expectations for governments and how to behave. And you can say, of course, that yes, well, they were still violated, but the world hadn't been better off if we had no rules at all. And actually, by pushing these rules and bringing up one government at a time is really the method that we have as people who want more than what governments want right now. So, of course, if we're going to change our behavior, laws must be put in place. And we need to draw this kind of line in the sand, and this is no longer acceptable behavior. And I think when it comes to fossil fuel, that's really what we need to do right now. We cannot, make all these excuses anymore. We need to say this is unacceptable behavior, and we cannot wait for the slowest country to act. We cannot wait for all 195 governments in the world or something to agree on something by consensus. We need to start with the core group of governments that set the standard high, and then we get to work on bringing more and more states on board, but also other actors. It's not just states that shape the world these days. Cities do, banks and financial institutions do, parliamentarians do, faith leaders do, media, civil society, of course. So law really matters. And I think that The experience that we have from the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, from the campaigns to ban landmines, cluster munitions, from the campaigns to set up the International Criminal Court, for example, all show that these are things that we can do. We can't control everything in the world, but we can do these things, and these instruments, they really, really work.
Thank you so much. For those who are new to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, we'll put the link in the chat. We have a growing list of faith leaders, youth leaders, as well as cities from around the world, with just Paris last week, who are passing motions at Council to support the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I want to turn now to Vanessa Nakata, is a climate justice activist from Uganda. She was the first Fridays for the Future climate activist in Uganda and founder of the Rise Up climate movement, which aims to amplify the voices of activists from Africa. Vanessa, COP27 is being touted as the African COP. What are messages that African activists need us to start amplifying now to lay the foundation for a successful COP?
Thank you so much. One of those messages is the issue of loss and damage. We know that the African continent is one of the continents that is suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis, being responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions. We've seen the occurrence of different climate disasters, from floods to landslides, to cyclones, to storms and droughts, that have left people with no food to eat, that have left people with no water to drink, that have left people with no access to schools or hospitals because of the destruction. We saw the Eastern Africa drought that left over 26 million people with no access to food. We saw the tropical storm Anna in Southern Africa that left over 80 people dead and much more property destroyed. So I think it's important that we really address the loss and damage that is being driven by fossil fuels in African nations right now. The climate crisis is pushing us to a place where we cannot adapt anymore. Because when you look at, when you look at starvation, communities cannot adapt to starvation. Communities cannot adapt to the loss of their cultures or the loss of their identities or the loss of their traditions. Communities cannot adapt to the extinction of species. This is what the climate crisis is doing. And the climate crisis is being driven by the burning of fossil fuels. So there is need to acknowledge that loss and damage is here with us right now. There is also need to acknowledge that leaders at COP27 must understand that just a dialogue or conversation on loss and damage is not enough. We need real action. We need real finance, real money to be put in place for loss and damage, for the vulnerable nations, for the communities that are on the front lines of the crisis. We don't want statements that will promise action and yet not followed by action. So one of the things that really need to be talked about and highlighted as we head to COP27 is the need for a compensation fund to be put in place for loss and damage. And there is also a need for the amplifying of the voices of the people from not only Africa, but all the most affected areas. And what will make, COP27 an African COP will not just be the fact that it's in Africa. It will be the amplifying of the voices of activists from the African continent. It will be the presence and representation of activists and communities from the African continent. But it will also be the acknowledging of challenges like losses and damages and climate finance to be put in place for loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And some of the things we've been talking about as we start to design the principles and mechanisms under the Fossil Fuel Treaty is also how to ensure equity in the role of production decline, which will mean increased support for developing nations, and that wealthy countries need to act first. This is going to mean not only loss and damage, but I think debt forgiveness and new mechanisms which are only just starting to be designed by a number of the international lawyers and diplomats who are working on the treaty. We have 2 more speakers, and I think we'll have time for a couple of questions. So please, if you have questions, please place them in the chat, and I'll see what I can do to get to them. Next, I want to turn to Mercy Barons. Mercy is a member of the Indonesian House of Representatives. She is chair of the Green Economy Caucus and is a member of the Commission Concerning Energy and Mineral Resources, Research and Technology, and the Environment. MP Barons, as another parliamentarian from the Global South, does this report today change anything about what your demands are from the wealthier nations in addressing the climate crisis?
Okay, thank you very much about the questions. Actually, I want to say frankly that the report already gives the data and fact related with the impact of the carbon emissions and needs global movements and to accelerate transition energy from the fossil fuel to the renewable energy. But my point of view is the important of critical points is how to follow up the report, how to implement, how to accelerate, and how to ensure all the transition energy can move or can running based on the NDC targets of Paris agreements. And what about the developing, what about the developing countries and poor countries in the process? Actually, I want to emphasize 4 points, a few ones related with the pandemic of COVID-19 situation, give disrupted or detrimental situation for both economic and social sphere, and respective governments for developed or developing or poor countries has implemented the recovery policy by involving a large fiscal review and recovery spending policy. Indeed, I can say that it can be a golden opportunity to stimulate the economy recovery, will generate green developments. So we need the global comprehensive recovery frameworks should be taken and implemented for now and so on. The second is related with COP26, during the COP26 and after, post the COP26 in Glasgow. Has already closed, we know that, and it has campaigned on the 4 focal points. One is related with the change mitigation, a strengthened adaptation approach, a climate financial flow globally, and a solid global collaboration. So all countries are expected to step up the NDC and long-term strategy to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. The third, I want to say honestly that all parties in the COP26 actually have improved the NDC targets to reaffirm a clear trajectory to mitigation and adaptation. But during the COP26, all countries have stated their pledges in different levels. Their 5 pledges are on the coal phase out, methane reduction, interconnected green grids, and product efficiency and net zero emission targets. So what about the situation after we state a different level of 5 pledges globally? Because I know that it's like not focal point, but like a variable, important variable to accelerate the transition energy, because from developing or poor countries, we start in different what we call it starting point, something like that. The third is related with the Indonesian position. Indonesian position in Asian or in a global economy global. Indonesia holds now a strategic position as a member of G20. And as we knew that in November this year, Indonesia will host the presidency G20 this year by raising three main agendas. Those are inclusive recovery, digital transformation, and energy transition. Indonesia is expected to represent developing and poor countries' voice in presidency G20 in November this year to build a just and equal collaboration and ensure to scale up the critical responsibility for developed countries to developing or poor countries in mitigating carbon emission and how to accelerate transition energy from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And the last point, I want to emphasize about what actual demand from the developing or poor country to the wealthier or the developed countries. The big challenge in this issue is regarding international assistance or global assistance from developed countries to developing or poor countries is in terms of accelerate net zero emission, particularly in terms of energy transition, should be, as I said before, should be done through a just, transparent, and equal dialogue, negotiation, and commitment between among developed countries and developing or poor countries about transfer knowledge, skill, and technology, carbon cap and trading mechanism, financial climate change flow, and particularly in energy transition through enhanced renewable energy, energy conservation, and energy efficiency, and strengthening the global cooperation in green development to green more jobs as well. And the last point is related with the FTA, Free Trade Agreement or Bilateral Investment Treaty. Free trade agreement among the developed and developing or poor country is not the same meaning with the fair trade. We are not the same player in the same field in a global economy. So how to put the green investment as the binding principle among the parties must be or should be considered to the green development, sustainable development. So this is my point of view or my insights related with what the positioning among all actors between the wealthier countries, developing countries, or poor countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being with us on what I know is a very busy day for you and for all of your leadership with the parliamentarians for a fossil-free future. Very excited how quickly that statement is going with parliamentarians signing on from around the world. Our final speaker today, just before the launch of the IPCC report, last but not least, is Mark Campanale, is the founder and executive chairman of the Carbon Tracker Initiative and conceived the unbearable carbon capital markets thesis. Prior to this, Mark spent several decades working for major institutional asset management companies. Mark sits on the steering committee, the global steering committee, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and is also the chair of a new initiative, the Global Registry of Fossil Fuel Production. Mark, it seems like every year there's a series of more and more reports that ramped up the risks of fossil fuel investments, and the latest from the IPCC seems no different. But what I want to ask you is, what movement are you seeing in the finance sector? And what do you think are the next critical steps? How does this relate to the registry and the treaty, in your opinion?
Thanks, Zipporah. So what we're going to see with this new IPCC report is, I'm afraid, a repeat of the tension that existed for over the previous decade. The science has always been very clear, but we've got these other two groups which are trying to pull the science. One is the politics, what's acceptable, what can be done now, and the other is the economics. And it's quite clear that that the science just underpins the urgency to take the transition seriously. But the good news, and I'm afraid this needs to be emphasized a lot more, it doesn't, in the IPCC isn't really structured in this way, but the good news is that renewables are now cheaper in most parts of the world than fossil fuels. The world's going to see huge savings to ordinary citizens from a just transition to a low carbon world, fundamentally because renewables are cheaper. And that will provide security and benefits for all. That message we're still fighting to get across in the politics, and the science doesn't really necessarily address this as much as it should. Now, when it comes to the finance, now our audience, this is Carbon Tracker, is financial institutions and financial regulators, and they're quite aware of this tension. As I see it now, and I'm on the advisory council of GFANZ, Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, also in the Race to Zero working group of the climate champions looking at oil and gas, is that banks are very hesitant to break the relationships that they've had with the fossil fuel industry. And yet this is absolutely the urgency of what we need to do now. We need to give conviction to the boards of the major global banks funding coal in particular, but also oil and gas, not to extend the life of projects, not to build new capacity in the fossil fuel system. And in the back of all of this, of course, we've got the International Energy Agency's 1.5 degrees net zero scenario that says no new investment is needed anywhere in new coal and gas. So just the other day, the Dutch group of over $1 trillion of asset managers came out to support the IEA's no new investment is needed, and is writing to companies, the major oil and gas producers, saying, look, we don't want you investing in new projects. We need to see this globally. We need to see support, an international financial agreement, very similar to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, that says to the bankers and the investors, look, don't fund more fossil fuel expansion. I'm hoping that's the message that will come out through GFANZ, which is a $130 trillion coalition that actually then lines up and supports the science. That's what I'm hoping. Is a big ask. I think that's the importance of civil society groups is needed. And we need to hear the voice of politicians as well that says, look, if the bankers won't do this, we'll regulate to make sure that it happens.
Thank you so much, Mark. And it looks like you truly did have the last word. It is 7:57, and I know that there are probably most of us who are now rushing off to the IPCC press conference. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us on this important and I think historic day. We heard about the urgency to act, the cost of inaction, the need for equity and wealthy countries to act first, the tension between physics and politics, the willful ignorance of politicians who are still planning new fossil fuel projects, and a call for a new, bold fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty from faith, from science, from elected officials, and today from Ukrainian civil society calling for a fossil fuel treaty. The statement from Ukrainian civil society is now live. There are many ways to get involved in the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and we urge you to take a look at fossilfueltreaty.org and to join us. Visit campaign.fossilfueltreaty.org for campaign tools. The team around the world, joined by over 1,300 civil society groups from around the world, is coordinating a global week of advocacy for the Fossil Fuel Treaty from April 22nd to 29th. This will be a major push to engage environment ministers, foreign ministers, and other key officials. And our team has shared a link there in the chat with resources available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today to set the context for today's IPCC report, which we will all hear released in now 2 minutes. Thank you.